The funny thing is, the mailbox never moved. It was the clock that suddenly mattered. 10 days, a bright red deadline typed in all caps, and a tiny line at the bottom of the violation notice: fines begin accruing at 5 p.m. on day 10. That line sat in my brain like a ticking sound I could almost hear, even as the late afternoon sun threw long orange streaks across the main gatehouse. I stood there at the entrance to our gated community, staring at my old cast-iron mailbox like it had betrayed me. It hadn't changed in years. The same curved top, the same deep green paint, the same brass numbers my dad had helped me screw on when I first moved in. It was the board that had changed. Somehow, overnight, this harmless metal box had turned into a threat so severe they were timing its execution down to the minute. The violation notice was impossible to miss. One copy taped right to the side of the mailbox cluster, another pinned neatly to my front door back at the house, both printed on that stiff, slightly glossy paper the association loved to use when they wanted to feel important. A bold subject line declared that my mailbox at the main gatehouse was non-compliant and unsafe. Beneath it, in smaller font but even sharper wording, it ordered me to remove and replace it with the standard association-approved design within 10 calendar days. If I did nothing, fines would start at $50 a day at exactly 5 p.m. on that 10th day. Not midnight. Not the next morning. They chose 5 in the afternoon, that perfect little window where most people are crawling home from work, stuck in traffic, not watching the clock. It was so precise, so petty, that it told me everything I needed to know about what kind of fight this was going to be. I took in the scene around the main gatehouse and tried to imagine how this could possibly be real. The security arm lifting and dropping with each car, the soft whirring sound of the motor as the gate opened and closed, the faded landscaping lights that would snap on as soon as the sun dipped. My mailbox sat at the end of the row like it always had, slightly different, sure, but solid and heavy, anchored in the concrete. It had never tilted, never rusted, never so much as wobbled when the delivery truck leaned on it by accident one winter. The association's new, standard boxes, stacked in the maintenance shed, looked flimsy in comparison. What got me wasn't just that they'd decided it was non-compliant. It was the word unsafe. The notice said it twice, like repeating it would make it true. Unsafe to whom? To what? It felt less like a safety issue and more like the opening scene of an HOA revenge story I never signed up for. I slid the notice out of its plastic sleeve and read it again, this time slower. There it was in print, Standard 6.2, Mailbox Specifications. The board was citing a specific section of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, like a prosecutor reading out charges. 10 days to comply, or the $50 fines would begin at 5 in the afternoon, and they could add removal by the association at owner's expense if I ignored them long enough. The thing is, I'm not the type to rip something out just because someone in a polo shirt gets twitchy about uniformity. I've lived in this neighborhood long enough to know how the board operates when they think no one's paying attention. Timing the fines to start at 5 p.m. told me they were counting on me to miss something, to slip up, to blink first. I tucked the notice under my arm, kept my eyes on that smooth, rounded top of my mailbox, and let myself feel the sting of it. Then, under the sharp smell of hot asphalt and car exhaust, a different thought cut through my annoyance. If they were going to weaponize the rules and the clock, I was going to weaponize something else. The paper trail. The history. Every page they conveniently forgot about when they decided to make an example out of me. They thought this was just about a mailbox. They had no idea what they just pulled out of the ground. To understand why that single notice set me off, you have to understand the world it dropped into. Our neighborhood is one of those planned developments with a big stone entrance sign, manicured flower beds, and a gatehouse that looks like someone tried to design a tiny courthouse and then shrunk it. Sprinklers click on in the early mornings, leaving a thin film of water on the asphalt that smells faintly like wet concrete and fertilizer. Everything here is curated. The trees are scheduled. The grass has its own calendar. The Homeowners Association writes a monthly newsletter that talks about community standards like they're a brand. When I bought my place almost 10 years ago, I signed the same binder of paperwork everyone else did. Buried in there were the CCRs, the architectural guidelines, and a whole section on exterior elements, which included the shared mailbox clusters at the main gatehouse. Back then, the rules were firm but not insane. The mailboxes were supposed to be sturdy, in neutral colors, mounted to the concrete pad at the gatehouse, and clearly numbered. But they left the door open for decorative variations approved by the architectural committee. That one line is how my mailbox was even born. I'm a designer by trade, and the standard metal boxes the developer installed made me sad. They rattled in the wind and dented if you looked at them wrong. So when I moved in, I submitted an application, a full architectural approval packet, mailbox, with a color sketch, dimensions, and a note that the unit would be anchored to the existing base. The packet came back stamped and signed, dated July 18, 2014, with a neat little signature from the committee chair at the time. Approved. No conditions. I kept that packet. I keep a lot of things like that, partly because it's just how my brain works and partly because I've watched enough homeowners association drama to know that boards have short memories and long opinions. The current board is not the one that approved my mailbox. That's a big part of the problem. A few years ago, a slate of reform candidates swept into power with promises about protecting property values and maintaining consistency. Our president, Marla, was at the front of that wave. She wore structured blazers to pool parties and spoke in phrases she clearly lifted from corporate memos. To her, every chipped brick or mismatched porch light wasn't just an eyesore, it was an attack on the brand. Alongside her was the treasurer, a quiet man everyone calls Mr. K, who speaks rarely but seems to enjoy nodding when someone suggests a new fee. The property manager, Dana, technically works for a third-party company, but she is the board's favorite messenger. Between them, they turned compliance into a kind of neighborhood sport. At first it was small things. Notes about trash cans visible from the street. Reminders about keeping holiday decorations within approved dates. A gentle push to repaint faded shutters in association-approved tones. It was annoying, sure, but it was also what people expect when they sign up for association life. The word petty floated around, but most of us rolled our eyes and moved on. Then the tone shifted. The monthly newsletter started featuring photos of positive examples of compliant homes and vague warnings about enforcement actions for repeat offenders. They held a special meeting about visual clutter at the entrance, which meant they were irritated by how the main gatehouse looked in photos. Someone said the phrase curb appeal at least 6 times. That's when I first heard them mention the mailboxes. They wanted them to be uniform and brand aligned, whatever that means for metal boxes that hold bills and junk mail. They started talking about a standard association mailbox design, and the phrase standard 6.2 floated out of Marla's mouth like she was reading it off a script. I remember the room feeling colder even though the air conditioning had kicked off. I knew standard 6.2 existed, but I also knew my mailbox had been explicitly approved before the current board even owned homes here. I wasn't worried. I had the signed packet, the concrete base, the numbers aligned exactly where they needed to be. If anything, my box was in better shape than the dented, chipped units around it. Then came spring, and with it, a rumor. Supposedly, the association's insurance carrier had flagged the entrance for a safety review. The board circulated an email about a recent risk assessment and their commitment to addressing potential hazards at the main gatehouse. They mentioned visibility, access, and projecting structures. That last term made my stomach tighten, even before I saw the violation notice. They never said my name in those announcements. They never even said mailbox. But anyone who drove through the gate could tell which unit they thought was the problem. It was the one that didn't look like a boring catalog order. A few weeks after that email, the first physical clue appeared, a little orange dot of spray paint on the concrete next to my mailbox post. At the time, I assumed it was some utility marking. I made a note of it on my phone anyway. I've lived here long enough to know that in this neighborhood, fresh paint means someone has plans. So when I finally held the violation notice in my hands, dated May 2nd and labeled Notice of Violation, Mailbox Noncompliance, it didn't feel random. It felt like the end of a conversation they'd been having about me without using my name. The notice referenced Standard 6.2 directly, claiming my mailbox at the main gatehouse was not the approved design and posed a potential safety hazard due to its non-standard projection and weight. It informed me that I had 10 days to comply or face $50 daily fine starting at precisely 5 p.m. on May 12. That was not an accident. Fines starting in the late afternoon of a Friday, right before a weekend, meant their clock could run a little while before most people even knew what was happening. In a board like ours, precision like that is not about fairness. It's about leverage. I slipped the notice into a clear sleeve and added it to a growing mental stack of evidence. Somewhere in my office, the approved architectural approval packet, mailbox was sitting in a file box, waiting to be pulled out. The rules might have changed since 2014, but history still matters. And in this neighborhood, paper speaks louder than opinions. The morning after I got the notice, I went back to the gatehouse before work. The sky was cloudy, the light flat and gray, making the white paper of the violation notice stand out like a slapped handprint against the bulletin board. Somewhere beyond the fence, a lawnmower droned, that low mechanical hum matching the way my thoughts buzzed. I wasn't looking at the notice anymore. I was looking at every mailbox around mine. If they were going to call mine unsafe and non-compliant under Standard 6.2, I wanted to see how clean the rest of their precious lineup really was. I took my time, walking the length of the concrete pad like I was just checking for mail. Each box, I noticed something. One of the standard units had a bent corner where a delivery truck must have kissed it during a tight turn. Another leaned slightly, the base cracked where the concrete had settled. 2 units down, there was a hairline rust crack right along the hinge of a supposedly approved door. And then there were the add-ons. Little magnetic clips someone used for seasonal decorations. A faded plastic flower someone had jammed into a mounting hole and never removed. A loose screw here, a lifted corner there. Nothing catastrophic, but if the board cared about safety as much as they claimed, they had plenty of targets before they got to my solid, overbuilt, fully anchored mailbox. My unit sat at the end, heavy and intact. The door closed with a soft, satisfying thunk. The edges were rounded, not sharp. It didn't lean. It didn't rattle. It was different, yes, but different is not the same as dangerous. That's when the story stopped feeling like a one-off annoyance and started feeling like a pattern. The president who wanted uniformity, the board that loved control, the insurance memo about risks, the obsession with the main entrance, the precise 5 p.m. fines. The mailbox was just the excuse. The real issue was power. Who had the right to define what belonged here and what didn't, even when the past said otherwise? I took photos. Every dent in an approved box. Every crooked post. Every frayed edge on the supposedly standard units. Close-up shots of the rust, wide shots of the whole line of boxes with my vintage unit standing like a well-behaved outlier at the end. This was bigger than a single violation, it was the start of a paper trail I knew I'd need. In my head, I could already hear the board's favorite phrases, even without anyone saying them out loud. Community standard. Visual uniformity. Insurance liability. I knew how they'd frame it because I'd listened to enough of their meetings to know their style. That made it clearer that this was never really about safety. It was about sending a message, and I was the easiest billboard at the gate. I thought about how someone watching from the outside would see it. A single different mailbox, suddenly targeted after years of calm, surrounded by chipped and bent, approved units no one had bothered to fix. It had the bones of a Karen neighbor drama, except this time that neighbor was an entire association with a letterhead and a rulebook. I walked back home with the notice under my arm and my phone filled with photos. Inside, my office felt cooler than the rest of the house. I pulled out the gray storage box where I keep everything HOA related, from old newsletters to budget breakdowns. Right on top, where I'd left it years ago, was the architectural approval packet, mailbox. The cover sheet was exactly how I remembered it, my name, my lot number, the description of the mailbox, the little original sketch, the measurements, the note about anchoring it to the existing pad. At the bottom, a neat signature from the old architectural committee chair, dated July 18, 2014. Approved. No conditions. Behind it was an old printed copy of the earlier version of the architectural guidelines. I flipped to the section on exterior elements and found the mailboxes. There it was, the line about decorative variations approved by the architectural committee. No mention of a single standard design. No prohibition on weight, projection, or style beyond basic safety and visibility. Back at my desk, I opened the email the board had sent with the updated CCR excerpt for Standard 6.2. The new version was harsher. It required the association standard mailbox design at all shared locations and mentioned no unapproved projections beyond 6 inches from the mounting plane. My mailbox extended more than that, sure, but it had been approved under a different rule set. And nothing in the updated language said they could retroactively yank approvals that were properly granted. I printed the updated Standard 6.2 and slid it into a clear sleeve next to the original approval packet. 2 eras of the same rule, side by side. Behind them, I added the notice of violation, Mailbox Noncompliance, dated May 2nd, with its polite threat of $50 daily fine starting May 12th at 5 p.m. That was the moment it really clicked. This wasn't just about stopping a fine before it hit my account. It was about whether the board could rewrite history and pretend the original approval never existed, all because they wanted a perfect row of matching boxes at the gate. If I let them do that quietly at 5 p.m. on day 10, what would stop them from doing the same thing to every other older approval in our neighborhood? The clock was still ticking, but now it wasn't just counting down to punishment. It was counting down to something else, the first shot in a fight over who actually controlled this place, the rulebook or the people willing to read it all the way through. I lined the documents up on my desk, the old guidelines, the new Standard 6.2, the approval packet, the violation notice. Above them, on my screen, I pulled up the association's own meeting minutes from the last few years, scanning for any mention of retroactive enforcement or mailbox replacements. Somewhere in those lines of dry text was the board's own pattern, their language, their weak spots. And somewhere in my file box, I knew there would be more little paper anchors they'd forgotten about. The evidence was already starting to stack up. 10 days to fix my mailbox, according to them. 10 days to build a different kind of case, according to me. As the numbers on the bottom right of my computer screen flipped closer to evening, another idea started to form, slow but sharp. If they wanted to talk about safety and standards at the main gatehouse, I might just take a closer look at everything they'd been ignoring there for years. But first, I had a letter to write and a design packet to weaponize. I did not start with a phone call. I started with a letter. I pulled up a blank document and typed out a subject line that matched the exact wording on the violation. I listed my lot number, the date of the notice of violation, mailbox noncompliance, and the reference to Standard 6.2. Then I set the tone the way my old boss in compliance taught me, calm, factual, and impossible to misinterpret. I stated that the mailbox at the main gatehouse had been installed under an approved architectural approval packet, mailbox, dated July 18, 2014, and that no one had ever rescinded that approval in writing. I walked through the history. I referred to the original guidelines, the clause that allowed decorative variations, and the signed committee approval. Then I acknowledged the updated Standard 6.2, pointed out that it did not state retroactivity, and asked for confirmation that my prior approval remained valid. I requested that the board place my account in dispute status in their system pending resolution, and that all fines related to this matter be suspended until they had responded in writing. I attached scanned copies of the approval packet, highlighted the signature and date, and attached a copy of the current Standard 6.2 for contrast. I added a short paragraph noting that my mailbox was anchored to the original concrete pad, had never shifted, and did not obstruct access for vehicles or pedestrians. I emphasized that I was concerned about safety too, which is why I had chosen a sturdy design. Before I printed it, I read the letter out loud to myself, letting the words hang in the quiet of my office. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was a mirror, held up to their own paperwork. I printed 2 copies, signed both, and tucked one into a bright yellow folder labeled Mailbox, Standard 6.2. The other I slid into an envelope addressed to the association's mailing address, with the notation "Attention, Board of Directors and Property Manager." Then I did something I knew would irritate them more than any angry voicemail ever could. I took it to the post office and sent it certified, with return receipt. If they wanted to start the fines clock at exactly 5 p.m. on May 12th, I wanted a second clock ticking in the background. The one that starts when professionals have to respond to something official. Over the next few days, the air around the gatehouse felt different, even if the weather did not. The mornings were still cool and damp, with that faint smell of wet grass and car exhaust mixing together, but the way people slowed their cars by the mailbox cluster told me the story was spreading. Neighbors drove past, eyes flicking from the gate arm to my mailbox. Some did a double take at the violation notice pinned to the bulletin board. A few looked toward the small security office window, as if the guard might be able to explain what was going on. No one said anything to me directly, they didn't have to. You can tell when a place is buzzing even if everyone is pretending not to stare. One afternoon, as I came through the gate, I saw two figures at the mailbox cluster, Marla, with a clipboard, and the property manager, Dana. They weren't there to check their mail. Dana had a metal measuring tape stretched across the concrete pad, while Marla wrote numbers down with neat, quick strokes. They moved from one standard box to the next, measuring distance and height, but they lingered at mine. They studied the projection of my mailbox from the mounting plane, measured the width of the post, checked the clearance from the edge of the driveway. At one point, Dana gestured toward the gate arm mechanism, then toward my box, as if drawing an invisible line between them. Marla nodded, wrote something else down, and then they both stepped back, looking at the row like artists evaluating a painting they didn't like. From where I idled in my car, I could see the way the afternoon light glinted off the clip on Marla's board. I thought of the documents on my desk at home, the original approval packet, the printed standard 6.2, the violation notice. It was like we were each building our own version of the same story. The certified letter tracking showed that the association had signed for my package 2 days after I mailed it. No one had responded yet. No email, no letter back, no note on my door. The silence told me they were not ignoring me, they were deciding how to handle me. On the 9th day of the 10-day clock, as clouds piled up low and heavy over the trees lining the entrance, a new piece of paper appeared at my front door. This one looked different. The paper was a little heavier, the font a little more formal, the heading bolded like a headline. It was titled Final Notice, Mailbox Noncompliance, dated May 12th. It referenced the earlier violation, acknowledged receipt of my correspondence, and informed me that the board had reviewed the matter. Then it stated that regardless of any prior approvals, the mailbox at the main gatehouse must be replaced with the standard design to address ongoing safety and uniformity concerns. They had not addressed the specifics in my letter. They did not explain how my approved mailbox suddenly became unsafe after nearly a decade with no issues. They did not reference the old guidelines. Instead, the final notice announced that fines would begin at $50 per day at 5 p.m. on May 12th. And that continued noncompliance could result in suspension of amenity privileges and additional enforcement actions. The words were clean, but the message was clear. They were betting that the threat of money and embarrassment would make me surrender. The final notice went straight into the yellow folder, where it joined the rest of my growing exhibit list. The date, May 12th, lined up exactly with that original 10-day deadline. They were still married to their countdown. They were still convinced that the clock was their weapon. What they hadn't realized yet was that I had started watching a different clock. The one that measures how long it takes a board to overreach in a way they cannot easily walk back once the right eyes are on them. The response I was waiting for came not as a letter, but as a notice slipped into everyone's mailbox at the gatehouse. It was printed on the association's newsletter template, a sheet that usually carried reminders about pool hours and landscaping schedules. This time, the headline at the top talked about Entrance Safety and Standardization Initiative. It described a recent risk assessment of the main gatehouse area, citing concerns about visibility, vehicle clearance, and structural consistency. It mentioned that the board would be taking steps to ensure that all fixtures, including mailbox units, meet the association's established standard design. It referenced Standard 6.2 without using my name, but the timing made it obvious. Tucked into the middle of the notice was a bland sentence about legacy fixtures that did not match current standards and would be brought into compliance over time. That was their new phrase for things like my approved mailbox, legacy fixtures. I read the notice twice, then reached for an older document I had tucked into the back of my yellow folder, a single-page board agenda excerpt printed from a meeting held March 3rd. At the top, under New Business, there it was, Entrance Risk Mitigation. Underneath, bulleted, were 3 items: gate arm maintenance, landscaping sightlines, and non-standard mailbox structure near main gate. That excerpt joined the others as one more piece of evidence that this had never been about a sudden safety concern, it had been a plan in search of a justification. A few days later, an envelope arrived in the mail addressed specifically to me. Inside was a hearing notice. The board was scheduling a compliance hearing regarding my mailbox. The date was set for the week after the fines began. The notice informed me that I had the right to present information, to submit written materials, and to attend in person. If I did nothing, they would make a decision without me. They had already decided to start charging fines at 5 p.m. on May 12th. The hearing, set for May 19th, was positioned as my chance to beg for mercy after a week's worth of charges. They were stacking the deck so that by the time I spoke, I would already be behind. That was when the stakes shifted from irritating to expensive. I did the math on the back of a piece of scrap paper. 7 days of $50 fines before the hearing even happened meant $350 gone, before I even sat down at their table. If they dragged it out for a month, that would be $1,500. If they recorded those fines on my account, they could use them as leverage the next time I tried to refinance or sell. This wasn't just a principal fight anymore, it was a slow leak that could drain thousands if I let it run. I felt the familiar burn of anger rise, then forced myself to set the pen down and breathe. Anger might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't win against people who live in bullet points and policy. Paper does. Patterns do. And nothing makes a board more nervous than the sense that someone understands their own rules better than they do. So I began to prepare not just for a hearing, but for something larger. I requested, in writing, copies of any risk assessment reports that mentioned the main gatehouse or mailbox structures. I asked for the insurance letter they kept referencing in vague terms at their meetings. I cited the section of the CCRs that gave owners the right to review certain association records upon reasonable request. Then I documented that request too, scanning it, printing it, and sliding it into the yellow folder. I also made another trip to the gatehouse, this time not to stare at my mailbox but to look at everything else. The concrete pad where the mailboxes stood had a long crack right down the middle, big enough for small weeds to push through. The curb near the pedestrian path had a chipped corner, sharp enough to catch a foot. One of the landscape lights near the walkway had a broken lens, leaving the bulb exposed and slightly tilted toward oncoming traffic. If we were going to talk about safety at the entrance, I wanted a complete picture. Not just of my mailbox, but of everything they had ignored while fixating on it. I took photos of the crack, the chipped curb, the broken light. I stepped back and got shots of the entire entrance, the line of box units, the way the gate arm swung close to the overgrown shrubs on one side. Back at home, I labeled every photo with date and time. I printed them and slipped them into clear sleeves, arranging them in the yellow folder behind the correspondence and the policies. Little by little, the folder was turning into a case file. The week leading up to the hearing had a strange energy. The weather turned sticky, the air heavy with that dull hum that settles in before a summer storm. The association sent out a reminder email about the upcoming board meeting, listing the time and place in the clubhouse. They mentioned that there would be an executive session for enforcement matters. They did not name me, but I recognized the timing. Inside my house, my office looked like a small command center. On my desk, I had laid out the key pieces in order: the architectural approval packet, mailbox from 2014, the printed version of the old architectural guidelines with the decorative variations clause, the updated standard 6.2, the original notice of violation dated May 2nd, the final notice dated May 12th, the hearing notice, and the board agenda excerpt with entrance risk mitigation circled. Behind those, I had the photos of the other mailboxes and the cracked concrete, the broken curb, the exposed landscape light. At the back, in a separate sleeve, I kept my own letter challenging the application of Standard 6.2 to an already approved mailbox and requesting that fines be suspended. Beside it, I placed the certified mail receipt and the little green return card showing that the association had signed for it. In the middle of the stack sat a new piece I had printed the night before, a one-page summary I wrote for myself, bulleting out the timeline. It started with my purchase of the home and the mailbox approval in 2014. Then it recorded the board's entrance risk mitigation agenda item in March, the violation notice in early May, the 10-day deadline, the final notice, and the hearing date. There was something grounding about seeing the whole thing laid out like that. It made their legacy fixture language feel even thinner. Outside, the sound of sprinklers clicking on broke through my concentration, followed by the low rush of water hitting already damp grass. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. The neighborhood looked peaceful, but my little stack of paper said otherwise. At this point, they had labeled my approved mailbox non-compliant, slapped a 10-day deadline on it with fines starting at 5 p.m. on May 12, and brushed off the old approval by calling it a legacy problem. I had dug up the original design packet, challenged Standard 6.2 in writing, documented their own agenda and notices, and started collecting evidence of every real safety issue at the Gatehouse that had nothing to do with my mailbox. With the hearing approaching, the question wasn't whether I would show up, it was how much I could make them see, in one sitting, that they had picked the wrong legacy to pick a fight with. The night of the board meeting, the clubhouse smelled faintly like coffee and dry carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that slightly washed-out glow that makes even confident people look tired. A long folding table was set up at the front for the board, with neat stacks of paper and a little plastic nameplate in front of each seat. Residents trickled in and took chairs in the audience. Some clutched copies of the latest newsletter, others just leaned back and watched. I carried my yellow folder and sat near the front, close enough to see the print on the handouts but far enough that I could watch the board without craning my neck. When they opened the general session, they went through the usual motions: minutes approved, financials reviewed, landscaping updates. At one point, Marla proudly mentioned the Entrance Safety and Standardization Initiative again, describing how they were making the entrance more consistent and secure. Her voice had that polished smoothness that comes from rehearsing in the mirror. Then came the announcement that they would be moving into executive session for enforcement matters. That was my cue. I followed the instructions on my hearing notice, approached when called, and sat at a smaller table facing the board. The room felt quieter here, the hum of the lights louder against the soft rustle of paper. I did not argue. I presented. I laid out the architectural approval packet, mailbox from 2014, and pointed to the signature and date. I referenced the prior guidelines and the clause allowing decorative variations. I contrasted them with the new Standard 6.2 that did not mention retroactive application. I reminded them that my mailbox had been installed, inspected, and accepted under the rules of its time. Then I slid the board agenda excerpt with entrance risk mitigation across the table, reminding them that the first time the phrase, non-standard mailbox structure near main gate, appeared in their records was only recently, despite my mailbox having been in place for almost a decade. I described the cracked concrete, the broken curb, the exposed light. I referenced the photos without slamming them down like accusations. I framed them as genuine safety concerns that deserved attention at least as much as my approved mailbox. I mentioned, calmly, that I had documented all of this because the association's own paperwork matters. That I wanted to work with them, but that I did not believe it was fair or reasonable to punish an owner for following the process years earlier just because standards had shifted. I watched their faces as I spoke. Marla's expression tightened around the eyes when I brought up the prior approval. Mr. K's gaze lingered on the certified mail receipt for a long second before he looked away. Dana's pen paused just above her paper when I talked about the cracked curb. They did not say much back to me, at least not in anything I could quote. They spoke in soft, careful phrases about consistency, concerns raised by security, the importance of a clear entrance. They floated the idea of transitioning legacy fixtures to the current standard over time. I listened, nodded when it made sense, and then reminded them that any transition plan needed to acknowledge past approvals, not erase them. I said that if they were going to hold me to a standard, it had to be one that applied equally to every mailbox and every risk at the Gatehouse, not just the one that bothered them aesthetically. When it was over, they thanked me for my time and said they would deliberate and send a decision in writing. I left the clubhouse with the yellow folder under my arm, the night air thicker and warmer than when I had gone in. Crickets chirped in the distance, the sound uneven but steady. As I walked back to my car, a thought settled in that I could not shake. Whether they sided with me or not in that hearing, the entrance was only half their story now. The other half was in my folder, in the dates, in the agenda excerpt, in the way they had timed the fines. And that half was something I could take beyond the clubhouse if I needed to. Because what happens when a board that is so focused on control and image is suddenly forced to walk their own entrance, point by point, with a checklist that does not start at my mailbox but at every crack, every broken light, every inconsistency they have ignored for years? What happens when that tour is not just for me, but for every neighbor watching, and maybe even for someone whose job title includes the word inspector? The board thought this was about one metal box at the Gatehouse. They hadn't yet realized that I was quietly preparing a tour of their entire front door, and that by the time I was done, it wouldn't be my mailbox everyone was staring at. The morning after the hearing, I woke up before my alarm. The house was quiet, pale light leaking in around the blinds, and for a second I almost convinced myself the whole mailbox fight was a weird, overly detailed dream. Then I saw the yellow folder on my desk, edges fanned with plastic sleeves and dates, and the feeling snapped back into place. The board would send their written decision soon. I knew that. But waiting passively had never gone well for anyone in our association. If the board was going to frame this as a safety issue at the main Gatehouse, then I was going to lean into that frame so hard they'd regret ever using the word. I sat down at my computer and drafted a new email, this time addressed not only to the board and property manager, but also to the generic contact address for the management company's regional office. The subject line was simple and impossible to misinterpret: request for on-site entrance safety walk. In the body, I thanked them for the hearing, noted that I appreciated the focus on safety, and requested a scheduled, documented safety walk of the main entrance area. I asked that the walk include the board, the property manager, and a representative from their management company, so that everyone was aligned on actual, observable conditions at the Gatehouse. I mentioned the cracked concrete, the chipped curb, and the exposed landscape light, describing them as potential tripping and visibility hazards. Then I did something subtle. I referenced their own entrance safety and standardization initiative and suggested that a joint safety walk would be a great opportunity to demonstrate the association's commitment to consistent enforcement. I copied a few neighbors who had quietly asked me what was going on with the mailbox notices, inviting any interested owners to observe. No accusations. No threats. Just a polite spotlight aimed directly at the entrance. I hit send and watched the little whoosh animation vanish off my screen. Outside, the early sun bounced off the windshields lining the street, a bright flare that made me squint. Somewhere in the distance, a delivery truck's brakes hissed against the stillness. It felt like the neighborhood held its breath for a second. The response didn't come instantly, but it came faster than I expected. Within 2 days, the property manager replied on behalf of the board. The email confirmed that they've welcomed owner engagement and would schedule a safety walk of the main entrance to review conditions and clarify expectations regarding Standard 6.2. They proposed a Saturday morning, 9 a.m., at the Gatehouse. The message mentioned that the board, the property manager, and a representative from our insurance consultant would attend. Owners were welcome to observe but were reminded that the board retains authority over enforcement decisions. The wording was stiff, but one sentence lit up like a small neon sign in the middle of the paragraph: insurance consultant. That was new. That meant someone with an outside credential was about to lay eyes on the same cracked concrete and broken light they had ignored while calling my approved mailbox unsafe. Word trickled through the neighborhood faster than the next newsletter ever could. I didn't fan it, I didn't have to. People who drove past the Gatehouse every day had already seen the violation notice, the final notice, and the hearing notice mailer. The idea of a safety walk with an insurance person at the entrance was too juicy to ignore. Saturday arrived heavy and humid. The air clung to my skin the second I stepped outside, and the sky had that hazy, washed-out look, as if someone had turned down the contrast on the whole world. When I reached the Gatehouse a few minutes before 9, the usual rhythm of cars at the entrance had slowed. People lingered an extra second as they passed, eyes drawn to the small knot of figures gathering near the mailbox cluster. Marla stood with her clipboard again, this time in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, projecting seriousness. Mr. K hovered near her shoulder, holding a manila folder. Dana, the property manager, clutched a tablet. Beside them stood a man in a plain collared shirt with a lanyard, the likely insurance consultant. A small group of neighbors had shown up too, pretending to check their mail or walk their dogs while obviously watching. The subtle murmur of their low conversations floated over the steady beep of the gate arm as it rose and fell. The faint smell of warm asphalt and cut grass hung in the still air. The safety walk started with introductions and a brief recap from Marla about concerns raised at the entrance. Then they turned to the physical space. The insurance consultant didn't rush. He moved slowly, methodically, like someone who knows he is being watched from multiple angles. He looked at the line of mailboxes first, starting at the far end away from mine. He tugged gently on posts, checked stability, ran a hand along edges to feel for sharp points. He paused at one of the standard units where rust had eaten into a hinge and the whole door sagged an inch lower than it should. He took notes. Then he moved along the concrete pad, stopping at the long crack I had photographed weeks earlier. He rested his foot near the raised edge, measured the height difference with a little pocket tool, and scribbled on his clipboard. When he reached the chipped curb near the pedestrian path, he crouched down, ran a finger along the jagged edge, and wrote something else. He didn't ignore the broken landscape light either. He tilted the exposed bulb, checked its angle toward the roadway, and nodded once to himself. Only then did he stop in front of my mailbox. For all the build-up, the moment was quiet. He looked at the unit from different angles, checked the mounting, and measured the projection from the mounting plane with the same tape they'd used earlier in secret. Everyone watched. I could feel the board's attention like heat on the side of my face. To them, this was supposed to be the star of the safety show. But instead of recoiling or treating it like a hazard, the consultant focused on different details. He checked the stability, confirmed that the base was sound, and ran a hand along the rounded edge of the metal. He asked a few generic questions about traffic patterns and gate arm clearance, the kind of questions someone has to ask for a report. Then he stepped back and wrote more notes. In that instant, with the air thick and still around us, something subtle shifted. The board had brought in an outside voice to validate their obsession, but the physical reality of the entrance told a different story: cracked concrete, chipped curbs, exposed lighting, sagging standard boxes. My overbuilt, fully anchored mailbox just didn't fit their narrative of danger. No one announced that shift out loud. They didn't need to. You could see it in the way Marla's grip on her clipboard tightened, in the way Dana leaned a little too hard on her tablet. The walk ended with polite, vague assurances that the consultant would prepare findings and share them with the board. They thanked everyone for attending and reminded owners that any updates would come through official channels. But as I walked back home, the humidity pressing against my skin, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the story they'd been trying to tell about my mailbox being the main threat at the Gatehouse had just collided with a different, less convenient reality. The board's written decision about my hearing arrived 3 days later in a plain white envelope that rustled heavier than regular mail. The letter had the association's logo at the top and the usual block of formal language underneath. But once I got past the throat-clearing phrases about careful consideration and commitment to community standards, the core outcome became clear. First, they noted that my mailbox had been installed under an approved architectural approval packet, Mailbox in 2014. They acknowledged that this approval had not been rescinded in writing. Then they pivoted, stating that while the new Standard 6.2 required uniform designs at shared locations, they recognized the practical realities of legacy approvals. The decision, all fines related to the alleged mailbox noncompliance were rescinded in full. Any charges that had technically begun accruing at 5 p.m. on May 12 would be reversed from my account. My mailbox, specifically, would be treated as a grandfathered fixture under a new policy the board planned to adopt for prior architectural approvals. They added that the board would be directing management to address additional safety items identified at the main gatehouse, including repair of the cracked concrete, replacement of the broken landscape light, and evaluation of the chipped curb. The letter did not mention the insurance consultant's findings directly, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. They did, however, include one more sentence, carefully worded, but telling. The board reserved the right to offer owners options for voluntary transition to the standard mailbox design in the future, potentially with association assistance where appropriate. There it was, the climb down. For a moment, I just let myself sit in the quiet satisfaction of it. The hum of the air conditioner blurred into the background. Outside, sunlight shifted across the wall, marking slow arcs as afternoon turned toward evening. This was not a movie ending where someone dramatically quit the board or the association collapsed in scandal. It was something quieter but, in a way, more powerful. In writing, on their letterhead, they had admitted that my mailbox was approved, that the fines were wrong, and that their precious entrance had bigger problems than one non-standard box. And the best part? They now had to fix those problems on their own dime. A few weeks later, orange cones appeared at the gatehouse. The concrete pad under the mailboxes was partially cordoned off as workers ground down the raised edges and patched the long crack. The chipped curb near the pedestrian path was reformed with fresh concrete. A new landscape light replaced the broken one, its lens shining clean and intact when the sun went down. My mailbox stayed exactly where it was. One evening, as I passed through the gate at dusk, the new light cast a soft, even glow across the whole entrance. The repaired concrete looked smooth and uniform. My vintage unit anchored the end of the row, steady and unbothered. Cars rolled through, the muted thump of tires over the repaired curb barely audible. Inside the gatehouse, I could see the security monitor screens reflecting in the window. For the first time in weeks, there were no bright white papers taped accusingly to the bulletin board. Just the usual notices about pool hours and trash schedule. In the months that followed, the fight over the mailbox turned into a kind of neighborhood legend, told in quieter tones at the pool and during evening walks. People would glance at the entrance, then at me, and ask how everything had ended. I'd point to the repaired concrete, the new light, and the letter in my files. The board never apologized directly. That's not how people like that operate. But their behavior changed. The next time they rolled out a new enforcement push, it came with actual policy language about grandfathering and a clearer process for hearings. They started listing dates and citing sections more consistently in their notices, clearly aware that someone might check their math. At the next annual meeting, attendance was noticeably higher. A couple of neighbors, inspired partly by what had happened at the Gatehouse, ran for open board seats on a platform of transparency and reasonable enforcement. They didn't win everything, but they won enough seats to change the tone in the room. The questions shifted from, how do we make everyone match, to, how do we avoid overstepping our own documents? As for me, I didn't run for the board. I didn't want to turn my home into a second job. But I did start showing up to meetings more often, yellow folder in hand, ready to quietly ask for clarifications when things sounded vague. It's amazing how quickly people become precise when they know someone is actually reading what they write. Every time I drove in through the main gatehouse, I saw my mailbox out of the corner of my eye. Not just as a piece of metal, but as a small reminder that these places only work when people are willing to push back, politely but firmly, against power used lazily. That's the thing about petty enforcement. It looks small until you run the numbers and see the fines they could have piled up, the precedent they could have set, the way they could have quietly reshaped the rules for everyone. Stopping it, even over something as mundane as a mailbox, matters. There was a cost to it, of course. Time spent drafting letters, organizing evidence, walking the entrance with a camera instead of just checking my mail. Emotional energy expended on a battle most people would have written off as not worth the trouble. But the payoff wasn't just that my mailbox stayed. It was that the next time the board looked at a legacy fixture and thought about slapping a deadline on it, they'd remember the Saturday morning safety walk and the insurance consultant's notes. They'd remember that sometimes, the thing you choose as your example ends up being the thing that exposes your own cracks. Tell me your own non-compliant HOA horror in one sharp line. If you think a fight over a mailbox at the main gatehouse is as petty as it gets, just wait until you hear what happened next door a few streets over. In that case, it wasn't a metal box causing chaos, it was a single potted plant on a front step that somehow triggered a full-on power struggle. Imagine a board that decided one neighbor's terracotta pot was an unapproved structure, and a neighbor who responded by reading every line of the CCRs and finding a loophole so exact that the association ended up paying for their own landscaping repairs. Picture a front yard that became a battlefield of measurement tapes, anonymous complaints, and a surprise guest appearance from a fire inspector who did not share the board's sense of priorities. If you want more overreaching rules, creative pushback, and the strangely satisfying moment when paperwork beats pettiness, you're going to want to stick around for that one.